The fire had not yet been lit when she walked in alone. Every eye in the great circle turned, slow and heavy, like wolves turning their heads in the dark. She did not flinch, she did not lower her gaze, and she did not speak a single word. The women sat wrapped in furs beside their chosen ones, their hands resting on strong arms, their faces soft with pride and belonging. But this girl, this quiet and unseen girl, carried nothing but dust on her bare feet and silence on her lips. She found the last empty stone at the edge of the circle, the one no one wanted, the one that faced the cold wind, and she sat down without a sound. No one reached for her hand. No one called her name out loud. The ceremony had not even begun, and already the whole village knew she would sit there all night, unclaimed and unseen, just as she had every season before this one. But then, something shifted in the air that night, something deep and old and strange, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Before we continue, kindly subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Her name was Vorith. Not a name given softly by her mother at the moment of birth, but one whispered carefully by the elders when she was still small enough to hold in two cupped hands. They said the word carried weight, like a stone pulled slowly from the very bottom of a cold and rushing river, and that it meant something only the wolves truly understood in the deep and quiet language of the wild. Vorith grew up on the far edge of the village, in a small and humble dwelling made of woven branches and packed mud, where the wind blew cold and sharp every single night without fail, no matter what season the world was passing through. Her mother had passed when Vorith was barely old enough to remember a face, only a feeling, a warmth, a soft and fleeting presence that vanished like morning mist. Her father had walked into the wild forest long before even that, never to return again, and no one in the village ever spoke of him or wondered aloud what had become of him. She was raised by the older women of the clan, fed scraps of dried meat and salted fish, taught to weave and to gather roots and berries, but never once taught how to be chosen, because that was not something you could learn from anyone. In their ancient world, being chosen was something that happened to you, or it simply did not, and there was no middle ground between the two. The mating ceremony was the most sacred night of the entire year for their people. A night wrapped in tradition and old magic, and a reverence so deep it touched the bones of everyone who took part in it. Once every full moon of autumn, when the air turned sharp and the trees dropped their very last leaves like golden tears falling to the earth, the young men and women of the clan gathered beneath the great oak at the center of the village, a tree so old and so wide that 10 men holding hands could not wrap themselves around its trunk. The elders built a fire from sacred wood that had been soaked for days in old oils and blessed by hands that had seen many, many seasons pass and turn and pass again. The women dressed in their finest furs, adorned with beads carved carefully from bone and shells found in distant rivers. Each beat a small and precious thing that caught the firelight and threw it back into the air. The men stood tall and proud across from them, their chests painted with ash and berry dye in patterns handed down from father to son, each one hoping with every breath in his body to find the woman whose eyes would catch his and hold him fast. And the wolves, the great and ancient wolves who lived beside their people in a bond older than memory itself, they came too, every year without fail. They padded out of the tree line, silent as shadows, their golden and amber eyes watching everything that unfolded before them, understanding far more than any human could ever guess or dare to imagine. Vorith had attended the ceremony 4 times before, and each time she sat on that same cold and unwanted stone. She watched the other girls laugh and lean into their partners with easy grace, watched the elders nod with quiet approval, watched the wolves circle the fire with a calm and knowing patience that seemed to stretch back to the very beginning of all things. And each time, when the night ended and the great fire burned itself down to nothing but a bed of glowing orange embers, she walked back to her small dwelling alone, the wind pushing at her back and no one beside her. No hand to hold, no voice to carry her name. The village did not mock her, not openly, not in words that could be caught and held up to the light. But the silence around her was its own kind of cruelty, sharp and quiet, and deep in a way that cut more cleanly than any spoken word ever could. Some of the older women pitied her, and pity, in their world, was almost worse than being forgotten entirely, because pity meant they saw her and chose to feel sorry rather than to reach out. Vorith had learned long ago to swallow that feeling down, to bury it deep beneath her ribs where no one could see it or touch it, and to keep moving forward, because stopping was never an option for someone like her, someone the world had not yet made a place for. This year, however, something felt different from the very first breath of the morning. Vorith woke before the sun had even begun to crawl above the hills, and she found the air outside her small dwelling heavy and completely still, as if the whole world was holding its breath and waiting for something it could not yet name. The birds were quiet, the insects silent, and even the wind, which never stopped blowing cold through her part of the village, no matter what time of day or night it was, had gone completely and perfectly calm. She stepped outside and looked toward the tree line, and that is when she felt it, a pull, not in her hands or her feet or anywhere she could point to, but somewhere deep and warm inside her chest, urgent and impossible to ignore no matter how hard she tried. She had never felt anything like it before in all her years of living, and it made her heart beat faster and harder without any reason she could name or explain. She did not tell anyone about this feeling, because there was truly no one close enough to her life to tell. But she carried it with her all through the long day, like a small and precious flame tucked safely inside her bones, burning steady and quiet and waiting. The preparations for the ceremony began at midday, and the village came alive with movement and noise and purpose. The elders directed the gathering of firewood and sacred herbs with calm authority. The women worked side by side to arrange the great circle of stones that had been used for this purpose longer than any living person could remember, and the young men painted themselves with care and attention, each one wanting to look his very best on this most important of nights. Vorith helped where she could, as she always did, carrying bundles of dry brush to the growing pile, weaving strips of tough leather into ropes, doing the quiet and unseen work that no one thanked her for, but that everyone needed done before the fire could be lit. As she worked, she glanced toward the forest more than once, drawn there by that strange and insistent warmth still burning gently in her chest, pulling at her like a thread tied to something she could not yet see. And each time she looked, she thought she saw something moving between the ancient and towering trees, something massive and dark and slow, something that seemed to be watching her with a patience that had no end. She told herself it was only shadows playing tricks on tired and weary eyes. But the warmth in her chest would not let that quiet lie sit easy, and somewhere, deep in a part of her that she had long learned to keep buried and ignored, she knew better than to dismiss what she felt when it spoke to her so clearly and so honestly. So the question that sat quietly and stubbornly in the back of her mind, the one she could not shake no matter how hard she tried or how busy she kept herself through the day, was this. What was coming toward her from that dark and ancient forest, and why did it feel like it had been coming for a very, very long time? The sun began to fall behind the hills when the ceremony finally started, painting the sky in deep oranges and reds that bled into one another like dye dropped into still water. The great fire was lit with a single torch passed from the oldest elder to the youngest child present, a tradition so old and so sacred that no one remembered who began it or why, only that it had always been done this way and always would be. The flames rose high and fierce and hungry, casting long golden shadows across the faces of every person gathered in the circle, shadows that danced and shifted with each movement of the wind. The drums began to beat, slow at first, like a heartbeat waking from a long sleep, then faster, building in rhythm and power until the sound filled the air and seemed to match the very heartbeat of the earth itself. The women took their places around the inner ring, dressed and adorned and hopeful, their faces lit warm and golden by the fire, and the men stood across from them, their painted chests rising and falling with each deep and steady breath. And the wolves, 7 of them that night, slipped silently into the circle from the dark edges of the forest like ghosts made flesh, their fur catching the firelight like polished and precious stone. Vorith sat on her stone, the cold one, the forgotten one, at the far edge of the circle where the light barely reached. She had wrapped herself in a simple brown fur, the only one she owned and the only one she had ever owned, and she had braided her dark hair back with a strip of worn leather, not because she expected anything to change for her this night, but because the ceremony demanded it of everyone who sat within the circle. The warmth in her chest had grown stronger since the morning, pulsing gently now like a second heartbeat keeping time beside her own, and she pressed her hand against her ribs as if she could feel it through her skin, as if touching it might help her understand what it was trying to tell her. Around her, the first pairings began, the elders calling out names in their deep and steady voices, and each time a man stepped forward to claim a woman, the crowd would hum with approval and warmth, and the wolves would dip their great heads in quiet and solemn acknowledgement of the bond being made. One by one, the women were chosen, and one by one, the empty spaces in the circle shrank and disappeared. Vorith watched each pairing with calm and patient eyes, feeling no bitterness rise inside her, only a quiet and familiar ache, like an old wound that had healed long ago, but left a scar too deep and too old to ever fully disappear no matter how much time passed over it. The fire danced and the drums played on, and the night grew deeper and colder around them all, pressing in from the edges like a dark and heavy blanket. She could feel the eyes of a few elders drifting toward her now and then, not with judgment or disapproval, but with something close to sorrow, as if they too understood that this was simply how the world had decided to treat her, and they wished it were otherwise but could do nothing to change it. And still, that warmth in her chest burned on, steady and patient and insistent, refusing to fade no matter how the cold night pressed in around her from all sides. Then the drums stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so sudden and total, that every person sitting in that circle held their breath at the exact same moment, as if the silence itself had reached into their chests and stilled their lungs. The fire itself seemed to flicker and shiver, as if something had disturbed the air far around it, and the wolves, all 7 of them, turned their great heads toward the tree line at the very same time, ears forward, eyes sharp, bodies still. Vorith felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, felt her skin prickle with something that was not quite fear, but was not quite calm either. Something in between, something older than both, and the warmth in her chest flared bright and hot, brighter than it had ever been before, so bright it almost hurt. She did not look away from the forest, could not have even if she wanted to, because something was emerging from between the ancient trees, and it was enormous beyond anything she had ever seen or imagined could exist. He moved like the forest itself had decided to take the shape of a wolf and walk into the light of the fire. His body was massive, beyond anything Vorith had ever seen or heard described in the stories told by elders on cold and quiet winter nights when the fire burned low and the children pressed close. His fur was the color of deep shadow, black as the space between the stars on a moonless night, and it rippled and shifted as he moved, as if it carried its own wind, its own breath, its own quiet and ancient life. His eyes were gold, not the soft and warm amber of the other wolves in the circle, but a deep and burning gold, like 2 flames that had been burning steady and fierce since the very beginning of the world. He was taller than the tallest man in the circle, broader than 2 men standing side by side with their shoulders pressed together, and when his great paws touched the ground, the earth seemed to press down and give way beneath him, as if even the soil knew to show him respect. Every single person in the circle went completely and perfectly still. The elders, men and women who had seen 70 and 80 seasons come and go, who had witnessed things that younger folk could barely imagine or believe. Even they had no words for what stood before them now, no stories old enough to match what their eyes were seeing. One of the older women whispered something to the elder beside her, a single word, spoken so quietly that only those nearest could catch it. But the word carried enough weight to change the very air in the circle, to make it feel heavier and older and more alive. The word was Kaelgrath. And even those who had never heard it spoken before in their lives somehow understood, in the way that ancient people understood things passed down through blood and bone and the silence between generations, that this name belonged to something older and greater and more powerful than anything their village had ever known or welcomed into its circle. Kaelgrath did not look at the crowd gathered around the fire. His burning golden eyes moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the circle with a patience and a calm that spoke of a creature who had never once in his long and ancient life been hurried or rushed by anything at all. He moved past the paired couples standing close together, past the elders with their knowing faces, past the younger wolves who had pressed themselves low and flat to the ground in a posture of deep and honest respect that needed no words to explain. And then his gaze stopped cleanly and completely, fixed on one single point at the far edge of the circle, on the cold stone, on the forgotten place where no one ever sat by choice. His eyes found Vorith, and they did not move from her, not for a single breath, not for a single heartbeat. The warmth in her chest erupted like a flame suddenly fed by wind. It was not painful, but it was so sudden and so full and so bright that it took the breath clean out of her lungs for a long moment, and she pressed both hands against her ribs, her eyes wide and her lips parted and her heart beating so hard she could feel it everywhere. She could not look away from him, did not want to, and something deep inside her, something she had buried and locked away long ago beneath years of silence and solitude and being unseen, began to stir and rise slowly like water finding its way back to the surface after a long and heavy rain. Kaelgrath took one step toward her, then another, slow and certain and unhurried, and the circle parted for him without a single person needing to be asked or told to move. The elders watched in silence, their old and weathered faces unreadable, but their eyes sharp and searching, as if they were trying to remember something important from a story told long before their own grandparents were born. The drums did not restart, no one spoke a word, and the fire burned steady and tall, and the smoke curled upward into the dark sky like a prayer no one had spoken aloud, but everyone gathered there was silently and desperately holding in their hearts. Caelgrath stopped before Voreth, close enough that she could feel the heat of him pressing against the air between them, feel the depth and the power and the age of him. And for one long and breathless moment, neither of them moved at all, and the whole world seemed to wait. Then he spoke. His voice was not what she had expected, not a growl or a low rumble or a sound of warning, but something deeper and warmer and stranger, something that seemed to come from a place far older than words themselves, older than the village, older than the fire, older than the great oak tree at the center of everything. It was low and steady and warm, and it filled the space around them both like water filling a hollow stone, slowly and completely and without hurry. He said simply and clearly, so that every ear in the circle could hear him, "Stand with me." No one moved for a long time after those words left his mouth and settled into the still night air. The circle held its breath, every face turned toward Voreth, every eye watching carefully to see what this quiet and unseen girl would do in the face of something so ancient and so vast and so far beyond anything the village had ever witnessed or known in all the long years of its existence. Voreth herself sat perfectly still, her hands still pressed against her ribs, her heart beating so hard and so fast that she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the soles of her bare feet against the cold stone beneath her. The warmth in her chest was no longer a gentle flame, but a steady and bright fire now, burning strong and clear, and it was answering him, reaching toward him, as if some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment without ever knowing it was coming or that it could. The elders watched her from their places around the circle, their old faces still and quiet, their eyes searching. They had seen many things in their long lives, many ceremonies, many bonds, many moments where two souls found each other beneath the firelight and the stars. But this was different, and every single one of them knew it. There was a weight to this moment, a heaviness that sat in the air like something you could almost touch if you reached out your hand. And it was not frightening, not exactly, but it was so old and so deep that it made even the bravest among them sit a little straighter and breathe a little more carefully. She looked up into his golden eyes, and she did not see a creature to be afraid of. She saw something ancient and patient and true, something that had crossed distances she could not begin to imagine and waded through seasons she could not begin to count, all to arrive at this single moment in this single circle on this single night beneath the stars. And in that look, in that one long and silent and unbroken exchange between two beings who had never spoken a single word to each other before this night, something was sealed, something deeper than words, deeper than ceremony, deeper than any tradition the elders had ever taught or any story ever told around a dying fire on a cold and quiet evening. It was not made in that moment, not born or created or begun. It was simply revealed, like a river that had always been flowing beneath the ground, finally breaking through the surface at last. Voreth felt something rise inside her that she had not felt in a very long time, something she had almost forgotten she was capable of feeling at all. It was not joy, exactly, though joy was part of it. It was not hope, though hope was there too, quiet and bright and trembling. It was something fuller than either of those things, something that filled her from the soles of her feet to the top of her head, something that made the cold she had carried inside her for so many years begin, slowly and gently, to thaw. She had spent her whole life feeling as if she was missing a piece of herself, as if something had been taken from her before she was even old enough to know what it was, and now, standing in the light of the fire with Caelgrath's golden eyes on hers, she felt that peace begin to settle back into place, quiet and certain and exactly where it belonged. Voreth rose to her feet. She did not stumble, did not hesitate, did not look to the elders for permission or guidance or approval, because this was not a decision that belonged to anyone else in that circle. It belonged only to her. Her legs felt steady beneath her, steadier than they had felt in years, and the cold that had always clung to that forgotten stone seemed to fall away from her like an old skin she no longer needed and no longer wanted. She stood tall, taller than she had felt in a very long time, and she stepped forward until she was standing right beside Caelgrath, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to know with every part of herself that this was real and not a dream brought on by firelight and loneliness and wanting. The crowd murmured, soft and low, like wind moving through dry leaves. Some of them leaned forward, drawn in by what was unfolding before them, as if the moment itself was pulling them closer without their permission. Others sat back, their eyes wide, their lips parted, watching in the kind of quiet stillness that comes when people witness something they have only ever heard about in stories told on cold nights. A few of the younger women pressed their hands to their chests, feeling something stir inside them at the sight of Vorith standing so tall and so steady, something that whispered to them that this moment was not just hers, but belonged to all of them in some way, a reminder that the world could still surprise even those who had stopped expecting it to. The elders exchanged glances, and something passed between them, old and knowing and heavy with meaning that stretched back further than any of them could trace. The eldest among them, a woman named Solène, whose hair had gone white as bone, and whose eyes still held the sharp and searching brightness of a hawk even after all these long years, stepped forward from her place at the edge of the circle. She moved slowly, not because she was weak, but because every step she took carried the weight of all the years she had lived and all the wisdom she had gathered in them, layer upon layer upon layer. She looked at Kael'grath first, long and searching, as if reading something written in a language only she could understand, a language older than speech itself. Then she looked at Vorith, and for the first time in the girl's entire life, Solène's face held something that was not pity, not sorrow, not quiet worry, but pride, deep and real and unmistakable. The kind of pride that a mother feels when she sees her child become who they were always meant to be. Solène spoke in a voice that carried across the entire circle without her needing to raise it at all, a voice steady and sure as the roots of the ancient oak. She said that the bond between a human and a wolf was not something made by hands or spoken into being by ceremony alone, but something that was born long before either one ever breathed their first breath into the world. She said that some bonds slept for generations, resting deep in the blood and the bones, waiting for the right moment and the right two souls to wake them, and that when they finally did wake, nothing in this world or any other could stop them from finding each other at last. Her words moved through the circle like a warm breeze, settling over everyone present, and for a moment, every person gathered there felt something ancient stir inside them, as if Solène's words had touched a part of them that had been sleeping for a very long time. The other elders nodded, slow and grave, their faces solemn and their eyes bright, and the wolves in the circle lifted their heads, their ears turned forward, as if they too were listening to something sacred being confirmed aloud at last after a very long silence. The fire burned higher in that moment, as if the flames themselves were celebrating what had just been said and witnessed beneath the stars. Vorith did not take her eyes off Kael'grath for a single second, and he did not take his eyes off her. The warmth between them was no longer inside her chest alone, but filled the space between their bodies, visible almost like a shimmer in the air on a hot summer day, warm and alive and impossibly bright. The crowd began to murmur again, not in shock or disapproval or fear, but in wonder, the kind of quiet and reverent wonder that comes when people witness something they always believed in but never truly expected to see with their own two eyes in their own lifetime. Some of the older women wiped at their eyes with the backs of their hands, and some of the men looked down at the ground, not out of shame but out of something softer, something close to being moved by a beauty they had not expected to find on this night. And Vorith, who had spent her whole life sitting at the edge of everything, unseen and unchosen, and quietly grieving for a place she thought she would never find, finally understood something she had never been able to name before. She understood that being unclaimed was never a flaw in her, never a curse or a punishment or a sign that the world had forgotten her or left her out on purpose. It was simply the world making room, keeping the space open and clear, holding it steady and waiting with infinite patience, until the one who was truly meant to stand beside her was finally ready to walk out of the dark and into the light. She had not been forgotten at all, not for a single moment of her life. She had been saved, kept whole and quiet and waiting, for exactly this, for him, for this night, for this fire, for this feeling that burned so bright and so warm inside her that it chased away every shadow she had ever carried. But the night was not yet finished with its gifts and its dangers, and there were those in the village who did not welcome this change with open hearts, and the story of Vorith and Kael'grath was only just beginning to unfold in ways none of them could yet see or prepare for. Not every heart in the circle was filled with warmth and wonder when Vorith stood beside the great wolf. There was a man in the crowd, young and strong and proud in the way that men who have never been truly denied anything in their lives often are, and his name was Cravath. He had been raised by one of the wealthiest families in the village, fed well and taught well, and given every advantage that birth and blood could offer in their ancient world. He had always believed, with every breath in his body and every thought in his proud and restless mind, that the mating ceremony was his night, his moment to shine and be seen and be admired by all who gathered beneath the great oak. He had painted himself with great care that evening, had chosen his furs with pride and attention, and had set his sights on a girl from across the village, one whose beauty and grace had turned heads and stirred whispers for 2 full seasons now. But that girl had already been chosen by another man before Cravath could step forward and claim her, and the sting of that had not fully left his pride when he saw Vorith, the girl no one wanted, rise to her feet and stand beside something so ancient and powerful that it made every man in the circle feel small and young and foolish. Cravath had grown up believing certain things about the world, and those beliefs had never once been challenged before this night. He believed that strength was something you could show, that pride was something you earned by being seen, and that the way the world worked was simple and fair. The strong were chosen, and the weak were not. He had never had reason to question any of this, because the world had always given him exactly what he wanted, when he wanted it, without him ever having to fight or wait or prove himself to anyone. He was the son of a man who had land and furs and influence, and that meant something in their village. It meant that doors opened before you reached them, and that people smiled at you before you even opened your mouth. But now, standing in that circle, watching a quiet and forgotten girl rise to stand beside the most powerful creature any of them had ever seen, something inside Cravath cracked, something small and quiet and deep, and he did not know what to do with the feeling it left behind. Cravath did not speak that night, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were sharp and dark, and those who knew him well enough could see the anger building behind them like a storm gathering dark and heavy clouds on the horizon. He said nothing as the ceremony ended and the last prayers were spoken by the elders, said nothing as the crowd began to drift back toward their dwellings in ones and twos, said nothing as the fire burned itself down to a quiet bed of glowing embers that would be cold by morning. But he watched Vorith, and he watched Caelgrath, and he watched the way she leaned toward the great wolf, the way her face softened in his presence, the way the warmth between them seemed to push the cold air back without either of them trying. He stored every detail away in his mind like a hunter studying the tracks of something he intended to catch and bring down before the next moon rose. The elders saw it too, at least some of them did. The sharper ones with the older and more careful eyes, and Solen, who had read the moods and the hearts of young men for longer than Cravath had been alive, felt a quiet and careful worry settle into her old bones that night as she made her slow way home beneath the cold and glittering stars. There were others in the village who shared Cravath's unease, though most of them kept it hidden behind polite faces and careful words. Some of the hunters felt uneasy at the idea of a wolf, even a bonded one, walking freely through their paths and their spaces, as if an old boundary had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Some of the mothers whispered to each other about what it meant for their children, for the future, for the way things had always been done and the way they expected them to continue. They did not say these things loudly, and they did not say them to Vorith, because no one in the village had ever said anything directly to Vorith about anything at all. But the whispers were there, moving through the village like a cold draft moving through a crack in a wall, and Cravath could hear them, and they fed the anger in him the way dry wood feeds a hungry flame. Vorith and Caelgrath walked together out of the circle and toward the edge of the village, side by side, silent but not empty. The silence between them was not the cold and lonely kind that Vorith had known all her life, the kind that pressed in and made the world feel smaller and darker, but something warm and full and comfortable, like a blanket wrapped around two people sharing a fire on a freezing winter night. She did not know how to speak to him yet, did not know what words to use or whether words were even needed between them. But she found that simply being near him felt like coming home after a journey she did not remember beginning. Caelgrath moved beside her with an ease and a grace that seemed almost impossible for a creature of his great size, his dark body flowing through the moonlit path, as if the shadows themselves were welcoming him back to a place he had always belonged. Every now and then, his golden eyes would drift toward her, not with hunger or demand or impatience, but with a quiet and steady patience, as if he was perfectly content to simply walk beside her for as long as she needed, for as long as the world continued to turn beneath their feet. They stopped at the place where the village met the wild, the thin line of worn earth where the paths of humans ended and the ancient forest began its long and dark and endless stretch. Vorith stood at that border and looked into the dark trees, And for the first time in her life, the darkness did not frighten her or make her want to turn and run back to the safety of the village. It felt like an invitation, open and unhurried and kind, and she knew, with a certainty that lived deeper than thought, that Caelgrath would not ask her to cross it before she was ready. He would wait. He would stand beside her without complaint or pressure. He would be there when she was finally ready to step forward into the unknown, and he would still be there long after that first step, because that is what this bond meant, not a single night of fire and ceremony and celebration, but a lifetime, a whole and complete lifetime, of standing side by side through everything the world could throw at them. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and something passed between them that neither of them needed to say aloud. But Cravath was watching from the shadows, not far away, hidden behind the edge of a dwelling with his arms crossed and his jaw still set tight, and the anger burning in his chest had not cooled even a little, and the night, despite all its beauty and its warmth, was far from over. 3 days passed before Cravath made his move, and in those 3 days, the village settled into a strange and uneasy quiet that everyone could feel but no one dared to name. People spoke in lower voices than usual, gathered in small groups and whispered to each other with worried faces, casting glances toward the edge of the forest where Voreth had been seen walking with Caelgrath in the early mornings when the mist still clung to the ground, and in the cool evenings when the light turned gold. Some of the older folk spoke of old stories, tales told by grandmothers and great-uncles on winter nights, about the rare and powerful bonds between humans and the great wolves, bonds that were said to carry a kind of magic older than fire itself, older than the village, older than the land. Children pressed close to their parents and listened with wide and wondering eyes, and even the younger hunters spoke more quietly than they normally would, as if the presence of something so ancient and so mighty had reminded them all, gently but firmly, of how small and young their village truly was in the face of the vast and endless world. Voreth spent those days learning Caelgrath in the way one learns a new and sacred thing, slowly and with great care and attention. She learned that he was gentle in a way that surprised her deeply, that he would lower his great and massive body to the ground beside her when she sat, that he would press his warm and heavy flank against her side when the wind blew cold and sharp, that his golden eyes softened in a way that was almost impossible to describe when he looked at her and only her. She learned that he communicated not only with his voice, which he used sparingly and with great thought, but with small and careful movements, a dip of his great head, a shift of his weight, a slow and deliberate blink of those burning golden eyes, and she began to understand him the way one understands the rhythm of the seasons, not with the mind alone, but with something deeper and older than thought itself. And Caelgrath, for his part, seemed to be learning her too, watching her with that patient and searching gaze, taking in every small thing she did, every quiet laugh that escaped her lips, every careful breath she drew, as if he was memorizing the shape of her, the sound of her, the very feel of her presence in the world. On the third night, Cravath came to the edge of the forest with 2 other young men, both loyal to him and both carrying sharpened bone weapons in their hands. He did not come to talk or to reason or to settle things in the way the elders would have preferred and the way tradition demanded. He came because the anger in him had grown too large and too heavy to hold any longer, because it burned in his chest like a hot coal that would not cool no matter how much time passed or how many nights he spent staring at the dark sky. He came because some part of him, the proud and wounded part, the part that could not bear to be seconded or overlooked, could not stand to watch the girl no one wanted become the woman everyone suddenly spoke about with awe and reverence. He wanted to prove something, though even he could not have said clearly what that something was, only that it burned in him and demanded to be answered. Voreth saw them coming before they saw her, and she knew immediately what their presence meant. She had been sitting at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in the brown fur she still wore, because it was the only one she had ever known, and Caelgrath had been beside her, his great body warm and still and calm in the moonlight. She felt something shift in the air, felt that old instinct rise in her chest, the one that had kept her alive and moving through a life that had not always been kind to her, and she turned her head just in time to see the 3 figures step out from the shadows. Cravath's face was set hard, his jaw locked tight, his eyes fixed not on her but on the great dark wolf beside her, and in his hand he held a spear of sharpened bone, long and thick and meant to do real and serious harm to whatever it touched. He spoke, and his voice was loud enough to carry across the still and quiet night air. He said that no creature, no matter how large or how old or how powerful, had the right to take what did not belong to it, and that Voreth was a woman of the village, not a prize to be claimed by something that belonged to the wild and the dark. He said it as if he truly believed every word, and perhaps in that heated moment he did, but the words were thin and hollow underneath, and everyone who heard them, including Cravath himself if he had been honest with his own heart, knew that this was not really about Voreth at all. Caelgrath did not growl. He did not bare his teeth, or rise up to his full and terrifying height, or make any sound at all. He simply lifted his great head, turned those burning golden eyes toward Cravath, and held the young man's gaze with a calm so deep and so absolute that it felt less like a stare and more like a weight being placed gently on Cravath's chest, pressing him down, not with force or violence, but with something older and heavier than force, something that lived in the bones of the earth and the roots of the oldest trees and the turning of the stars. Cravath's hand began to tremble around the shaft of the spear. He held his ground for a few more long and painful seconds, his pride fighting against something his body understood far better than his restless mind did. And then, slowly, without a single word being spoken by anyone, he lowered the weapon. His two companions had already stepped back, their own weapons hanging loose at their sides, their faces pale and drawn in the cold moonlight. Cravath stood there for one long and silent moment, looking at Caelgrath, looking at Voreth, looking at something inside himself that he had never wanted to see before. And then he turned and walked back into the shadows without another word, and his companions followed him close behind. And the night closed around them like water closing over a stone dropped into still and deep water. Voreth let out a breath she did not know she had been holding all that time, and she pressed her hand against Caelgrath's warm and steady side, and she felt his heartbeat beneath her palm, slow and calm and sure as the turning of the earth. She whispered something to him then, quiet and close, meant only for him and no one else in the world. She said, "You are the first one who ever made me feel like I belong somewhere." The seasons turned, as they always did, slow and steady and without pause or hesitation. Autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter, and winter melted slowly into the soft and tentative warmth of the early spring. And through all of it, Voreth and Caelgrath walked beside each other, steady and close and unbroken by anything the world placed in their path. The village changed around them, slowly at first and then with more speed, the way a river changes the shape of the land it passes through, not with violence or force, but with patience and with time and with the quiet persistence of water always finding its way. The people who had once looked past Voreth as if she were made of air began to see her, truly see her, not because she had become louder or bolder or more demanding of attention, but because she had found her place at last. And that place was beside something so ancient and so powerful that it reminded everyone of the old stories, the ones about bonds that could not be broken and connections that lived deeper than blood and bone. Cravath did not trouble them again, and the change in him was one that no one in the village could ignore. Something had shifted in him after that night at the edge of the forest, something quiet and deep and internal that no one could fully name or point to but that everyone could feel when they were near him. He grew less loud, less sharp, less hungry for things he could not hold in his hands or keep in his heart. Some said that looking into the eyes of Caelgrath had shown him something about himself that he had spent his whole young life running from and refusing to see, and perhaps that was true, because after that night, he carried himself differently, slower and more thoughtful, as if he was finally learning, for the first time in his life, to be still and to listen. So Len watched all of this unfold with her sharp and knowing eyes, and she smiled to herself in the quiet of her dwelling on many nights, because she had seen, in all her long and full years, how the world had a way of placing things exactly where they needed to be, even when no one watching could see the pattern until it was already complete and done. Voreth learned to enter the forest, and this was perhaps the greatest and most beautiful change of all. Not all at once, and not without fear or hesitation, but step by careful step, breath by steady breath, guided by the warmth of Caelgrath beside her and the steady pull that had lived in her chest since that first morning when the air went still and the birds went quiet. The forest was dark and deep and full of things she did not understand, and it was also beautiful in a way that took her breath away and left her standing still, ancient and alive and humming with a kind of quiet power that made her feel very small and very safe at the very same time. Caelgrath moved through it as if it were a part of him, which in many ways it truly was. And Voreth began to understand that walking beside him was not just walking beside a wolf, but walking beside a world she had never known was waiting for her, patient and open and ready. The other wolves of the forest began to come closer over those weeks, curious and cautious at first, then calm and accepting, drawn by the presence of their great alpha and by the quiet and gentle energy of the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. They would sit at the edges of clearings and watch Vorith with their golden and amber eyes, patient and still, and she would sit among them without fear, feeling their warmth and their breath, and their soft and rumbling sounds like a kind of welcome that needed no words to express or understand. She was not one of them, and they were not one of her, but they were bound now, all of them, by something that stretched back further than any of them could remember, and that would reach forward into a future none of them could yet see or imagine. And so Vorith, who had once sat unclaimed on a cold stone at the edge of a circle, who had believed for most of her life that the world had simply chosen to leave her out of its great and wonderful story, found herself standing at the center of something vast and old and unbreakable. She had not been left out at all. She had been waiting, and the waiting had been its own kind of strength, quiet and stubborn and true, the kind of strength that does not announce itself but simply holds, and now that the wait was finally over, she understood that it had made her exactly who she needed to be, not for herself alone, but for the great and ancient bond that had been reaching for her all along, patient as the roots of the oldest tree, steady as the turning of the stars above. Caelgrath never left her side, not once, not for a single day or night, and in the way he looked at her, in the warmth of his great body pressed close to hers on cold nights beneath the stars, in the slow and steady rhythm of his golden gaze that never wavered, Vorith saw the answer to every question she had ever asked herself in the dark and lonely silence of her old life. She was not forgotten. She was not unwanted. She was not alone. She was found. And the village, the wolves, and the ancient forest carried them forward together, into a life that had always been meant to be theirs, and theirs alone, stretching out before them like a road made of light. The seasons turned, as they always did, slow and steady and without pause or hesitation. Autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter, and winter melted slowly into the soft and tentative warmth of the early spring. And through all of it, Vorith and Caelgrath walked beside each other, steady and close and unbroken by anything the world placed in their path. The village changed around them, slowly at first and then with more speed, the way a river changes the shape of the land it passes through, not with violence or force, but with patience and with time and with the quiet persistence of water always finding its way. The people who had once looked past Vorith as if she were made of air began to see her, truly see her, not because she had become louder or bolder or more demanding of attention, but because she had found her place at last, and that place was beside something so ancient and so powerful that it reminded everyone of the old stories, the ones about bonds that could not be broken and connections that lived deeper than blood and bone. Cravath did not trouble them again, and the change in him was one that no one in the village could ignore. Something had shifted in him after that night at the edge of the forest, something quiet and deep and internal that no one could fully name or point to but that everyone could feel when they were near him. He grew less loud, less sharp, less hungry for things he could not hold in his hands or keep in his heart. Some said that looking into the eyes of Caelgrath had shown him something about himself that he had spent his whole young life running from and refusing to see, and perhaps that was true, because after that night, he carried himself differently, slower and more thoughtful, as if he was finally learning, for the first time in his life, to be still and to listen. So Len watched all of this unfold with her sharp and knowing eyes, and she smiled to herself in the quiet of her dwelling on many nights, because she had seen, in all her long and full years, how the world had a way of placing things exactly where they needed to be, even when no one watching could see the pattern until it was already complete and done. Vorith learned to enter the forest, and this was perhaps the greatest and most beautiful change of all. Not all at once, and not without fear or hesitation, but step by careful step, breath by steady breath, guided by the warmth of Caelgrath beside her and the steady pull that had lived in her chest since that first morning when the air went still and the birds went quiet. The forest was dark and deep and full of things she did not understand, and it was also beautiful in a way that took her breath away and left her standing still, ancient and alive and humming with a kind of quiet power that made her feel very small and very safe at the very same time. Caelgrath moved through it as if it were a part of him, which in many ways it truly was, and Vorith began to understand that walking beside him was not just walking beside a wolf, but walking beside a world she had never known was waiting for her, patient and open and ready. The other wolves of the forest began to come closer over those weeks, curious and cautious at first, then calm and accepting, drawn by the presence of their great alpha and by the quiet and gentle energy of the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. They would sit at the edges of clearings and watch Vorith with their golden and amber eyes, patient and still, and she would sit among them without fear, feeling their warmth and their breath, and their soft and rumbling sounds like a kind of welcome that needed no words to express or understand. She was not one of them, and they were not one of her, but they were bound now, all of them, by something that stretched back further than any of them could remember, and that would reach forward into a future none of them could yet see or imagine. And so Vorith, who had once sat unclaimed on a cold stone at the edge of a circle, who had believed for most of her life that the world had simply chosen to leave her out of its great and wonderful story, found herself standing at the center of something vast and old and unbreakable. She had not been left out at all. She had been waiting, and the waiting had been its own kind of strength, quiet and stubborn and true, the kind of strength that does not announce itself but simply holds, and now that the wait was finally over, she understood that it had made her exactly who she needed to be, not for herself alone, but for the great and ancient bond that had been reaching for her all along, patient as the roots of the oldest tree, steady as the turning of the stars above. Caelgrath never left her side, not once, not for a single day or night, and in the way he looked at her, in the warmth of his great body pressed close to hers on cold nights beneath the stars, in the slow and steady rhythm of his golden gaze that never wavered, Vorith saw the answer to every question she had ever asked herself in the dark and lonely silence of her old life. She was not forgotten. She was not unwanted. She was not alone. She was found. And the village, the wolves, and the ancient forest carried them forward together, into a life that had always been meant to be theirs, and theirs alone, stretching out before them like a road made of light. And so we come back, at last, to the very beginning, to that quiet girl walking into the circle alone with dust on her feet and silence on her lips, to that cold stone no one wanted, to that moment just before the ground began to tremble beneath her. Knowing now what we know, having seen what we have seen and felt what we have felt, the question that lingers, the one that will stay with you long after the fire has gone dark and the drums have fallen silent and the story has ended, is this. If Vorith had known, on that very first night she sat unclaimed and unseen on that cold and forgotten stone, that something so great and so ancient and so full of warmth was already on its way to her through the dark, would she have been afraid, or would she have simply smiled and waited a little longer? Many seasons passed after that night, more than Vorith could count if she tried. The village grew, as villages do when peace settles over them like morning mist settling over a river, quiet and slow and full of life. New children were born, new fires were lit, and new stories began to take shape in the mouths of the elders, stories that would be passed down long after the ones who lived them were gone. And at the center of many of those stories, spoken softly on cold nights when the flames burned low and the children pressed close, was the tale of a girl who sat on a cold stone and a great wolf who walked out of the dark to find her. Vorith never forgot what that cold stone felt like beneath her. Even years later, when she had a place of warmth and belonging that she never thought she would ever know, she would sometimes walk back to that spot at the edge of the circle, where the stone still sat, unchanged and patient as it had always been. She would sit on it for a little while, not out of sadness or longing, but out of something quieter, something close to gratitude. She sat there to remember who she had been before she knew who she was meant to become, and to honor that version of herself, the one who had endured and kept breathing and kept moving forward when the whole world gave her every reason to stop. Caelgrath was always nearby when she did this, never far, never gone. He would wait at the edge of the circle, his great dark body still and calm in the light, his golden eyes resting on her with that same patience he had carried since the very first moment he laid them on her. He never rushed her, never pulled her away, never made her feel as if her quiet and private moments were something he needed to be a part of. He simply waited, the way he had waited before she even knew he existed, and when she was ready to rise and walk back to him, he was always there, warm and steady and sure. The wolves and the people of the village learned to live side by side in a way they had not known before Vorith and Caelgrath showed them it was possible. The bond between them was not just a bond between two souls, but a bridge, a living and breathing bridge between two worlds that had always walked beside each other, but had never truly walked together until now. The wolves came closer to the village fires at night, and the children of the village learned to sit near them without fear, and something old and broken, something that had been cracked open long before anyone remembered how or why, began to heal, slowly and quietly, like a bone mending beneath the skin. Solène lived long enough to see all of this come to pass, and she smiled more in her final years than she had smiled in all the decades before them. She told the younger elders, on the nights when her voice grew softer and her eyes grew tired, that she had always known this was coming, that she had felt it in the air long before Caelgrath ever stepped out of the trees. She said that the world does not make mistakes when it comes to bonds like these, only delays, and that every delay is simply the world gathering its strength, gathering its courage and preparing the ground so that when the moment finally arrives, it arrives perfectly. The younger elders listened, and they believed her, because they had seen it with their own eyes, and seeing is a kind of knowing that no one can take away. Vorth grew into a woman of great and quiet strength, the kind that does not shout but simply holds. She became someone the village turned to when the storms came, not because she had the loudest voice or the sharpest mind, but because she carried within her something that had been forged in years of silence and solitude and patient waiting, something that made her steady when others felt the ground shake beneath them. She taught the younger girls what no one had ever taught her, how to find their own worth when the world had not yet shown it to them, how to sit in the quiet and the cold and know that it was not the end of the story, but simply the part before the beginning. And the girls listened, because they could see in Vorth's eyes that she was not speaking from imagination or hope, but from a life that had proven it to be true. And Caelgrath, the great Alpha, the Ancient One, the wolf who had walked out of the dark and into the light for one woman and one woman alone, he never changed. He was still massive and dark and golden-eyed, still calm in a way that made the earth itself feel steady beneath him, still gentle in a way that surprised everyone who came close enough to see it. He still pressed his warm flank against Vorth's side on cold nights, still lowered his great body beside her when she sat, still watched her with those burning eyes that held something so deep and so old that most people could only glimpse it and then look away, not out of fear, but out of awe. He was her anchor, and she was his reason, and together they were something the world had been waiting a very long time to see. On quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and the village settled into sleep, Vorth would sit beside Caelgrath at the edge of the forest, and she would lean into him, and the warmth between them would fill the air like a song without sound. She would not speak on those nights, and he would not speak either. And that was enough, more than enough, because they had already said everything that needed saying, and everything that needed to be felt had already been felt, deep and true and unshakable. The stars would turn above them, and the wind would move through the ancient trees, and the world would breathe in and out the way it always had and always would, and Vorth and Caelgrath would sit there together. Two souls that had found each other across a distance no one could measure, resting in the quiet and the warmth of a bond that was never going to break. And if you ever find yourself sitting alone, in the cold, in the quiet, in the place where no one seems to see you, remember this. Remember that the cold stone is not yours forever, it is only your waiting place, and somewhere out there, in the dark and the ancient wild, something great and patient and warm is already on its way to you, moving closer with every breath you take. You have only to wait a little longer. The end.